Paris, November 13, 2015. France against Germany. At 9:17, fans and players are startled by a loud bang. It marks the start of a horrific night of terror.
Qu'est-ce qui se passe?
Monsieur, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? Il y a eu un attentat.
The police battle against several terrorist groups at once, groups that are coordinating and synchronizing their attacks.
In 2013, when the Islamic State's head of special operations began to plan missions abroad, he drummed a three-stage strategy into the minds of his fighters. Get to the location, kill as many people as possible, hold hostages for as long as possible, and then die as media effectively as possible.
That same night, the search begins for those responsible for the bombings. The terrorists are being hunted by the police and the intelligence service. Arrests are made in Brussels and in the Paris suburb of Saint-Denis, where the leader of the terrorist group is tracked down and killed.
And no, these attacks are not just lone wolves. This is well documented. Even groups like ISIS, which is just one piece of this. Everybody knows, has a very sophisticated operational directorate that specifically plans and implements these attacks all across Western Europe.
But where do terrorist groups, for example those who represent ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, get all their information?
ISIS has an intelligence apparatus known as the EMNI. The EMNI were created by former members of Saddam Hussein's inner circle. These members of Saddam Hussein's inner circle joined ISIS, not for ideological reasons, to make money, but they brought that intelligence know-how and fused it with a terrorist group, making it very deadly.
Does the terrorists' know-how come from intelligence services?
France, the United States, Great Britain and Germany support the current regimes in the Middle East. We finance them, we buy their oil, we sell them arms, we build up their intelligence services and their armies.
So do our Western intelligence services actually sponsor terrorism? Is there such a thing as a global market for terrorism? On an October morning in 2015, a boat full of refugees from Turkey arrives at the Greek island of Leros. Among the refugees are two men who will later blow themselves up at the sports stadium in Paris, and another two terrorists. For 20 years, Claude Moniquet ran operatives for the French intelligence service. He is a leading expert on counter-terrorism.
There should have been 4 terrorist groups in Paris, but there were in fact only 3. 2 terrorists who are also supposed to take part in the attacks in Paris were missing. As they tried to enter Europe, they were arrested for carrying forged passports.
One of the men is Mohamed Ousmane. This photograph was taken by officers with the border control agency Frontex. Claiming to be a refugee, Ousmane had aroused suspicion when he told Frontex officials he was Syrian, yet could only speak a smattering of Arabic. He couldn't describe what his alleged birthplace of Aleppo looked like. Despite this, in late October, European counter-terrorism authorities allow Ousmane and another suspect to enter the EU. Both are ISIS terrorists. Apparently, they're to be kept under surveillance as they make their way through Europe. The two terrorists head north through the Balkans, guided via mobile phone by a handler in Syria. Along their way, they're provided with information, money, and a succession of new phones. This later becomes known from the chat histories on their phones.
Ousmane, who was originally assigned to be part of the Paris attacks, failed to get there.
The day after the Paris attacks, Ousmane and his companion are arrested in a refugee accommodation center near Salzburg and held in the local prison. Security analyst Sajan Gohel has studied the Ousmane case.
This man was a key member of the Lashkar-e-Toiba. It is believed that he was part of the operational planning for the attacks in Mumbai in 2008, yet nothing was done.
Mohammed Usman, Pakistani national, bomb maker, and a member of the Pakistani terrorist organization Lashkar-e-Taiba. The search for his tracks gets underway. In the West, Lashkar-e-Taiba is not as well known as Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but the organization is many times larger. It was established by the Pakistani intelligence service, the Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI for short. Along with the military, the ISI is regarded as the real controlling force in the country.
We know in Pakistan nothing happens without the approval of the country's intelligence service. But we also realize, of course, that a section of this intelligence service is playing a double game. With the Pakistani intelligence service, you never know if you're talking to the Pakistani government, to Al-Qaeda, to Lashkar-e-Taiba, or to another terrorist group. You just don't know.
One specialist who has followed the trail of terrorism from Pakistan to Paris is Jean-Louis Bruguière, a judge who has hunted terrorists for many years. Working for the French intelligence service, he's been able to prevent a global series of attacks.
The French intelligence service, the DST, was well informed about Lashkar-e-Taiba and worked very closely with the Pakistani intelligence service, but also with British and American intelligence. So Lashkar-e-Taiba was no stranger to us.
At first, cooperation with the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, appeared to be helpful. Bruguière learned of a man who was planning a terrorist attack on the other side of the world, a French citizen who had converted to Islam, Willy Brigitte. Brigitte intended to hit his targets in Australia.
They had already identified a number of potential targets, like an Australian military base and a civilian nuclear power station. And they had already bought the material needed to make a TATP bomb. So they were well advanced in their planning.
The terrorist cell had been exposed and a serious attack prevented. Now Bruguière made every effort to discover who was behind the terrorists' plan. Once again, the trail led to Pakistan, and yet again to Lashkar-e-Taiba. The leader of the terrorist militia, Hafiz Saeed, pictured here, is one of the most wanted terrorists worldwide. Originally, Lashkar-e-Taiba's attacks were focused on its archenemy, India, and the disputed border region of Kashmir. Thousands of bloody attacks in Kashmir have been attributed to Lashkar-e-Taiba. For decades, the terrorist organization's activities have been supported by the Pakistani Army and the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI. Pervez Musharraf, seen here visiting troops in the Kashmir border region in 2001, was chief of staff of the army and later became the country's president. The man who was at the helm in Pakistan for so long now lives in exile. He still stands by Lashkar-e-Taiba.
So how are we calling them terrorists? Why are you pushing them to the wall? Now America should decide whether to solve the Kashmir dispute or carry on siding India and call them terrorists, which is very unfair. It's a very unfair thing.
Under President Pervez Musharraf, the Pakistani state and its intelligence service intensified cooperation with terrorist organizations like Lashkar-e-Taiba.
Well, Lashkar-e-Toiba is supposed to mean in translation, Army of the Pure. Its original purpose was to fight the insurgency in Indian-administered Kashmir, but its ideology makes it more transnational.
The terrorist plans of Willy Brigitte underline these ambitions in frightening fashion. Bruguière exposed an entire network of sleeper cells, preventing attacks in Great Britain and in Virginia in the United States. But who was behind them? Sajid Mir, the man behind all three terrorist plans. This is the only known photograph of him. Even intelligence services have only sparse information on this shadowy figure.
Suspects in the US confirmed the existence of Sajid Mir and his role in recruiting and indoctrinating Westerners with the aim of sending them back to Europe or the United States to carry out attacks in the name of Lashkar-e-Taiba.
pour des opérations terroristes pour le compte du Lashkar et Taiba.
Bruguière pressed charges against Willy Brigitte and, in absentia, against his mentor, Sajid Mir.
J'ai lancé un mandataire international contre Sajid.
Through Interpol, I issued an international red notice warrant for the arrest of Sajid Mir. This meant that all 194 member countries of Interpol were instructed to detain him at once.
Dès qu'il le verrait.
The FBI put Sajid Mir on its most wanted list. But in Pakistan, there was no reaction whatsoever. Sajid Mir's trail also led to a terrorist who, under his control, developed a strategy of terror which extended as far as the streets of Paris. His name, David Coleman Headley.
This guy is very different from the other guy that I've looked at because this guy really, really enjoyed being a terrorist. And there's very few people like that. You know, most soldiers, they're soldiers, and that's what they have to do. Headley, no. Headley was born to be a terrorist.
Doctor and psychiatrist Mark Sageman grew up in France and made a career in America with the CIA. Today, he travels around the world assessing alleged terrorists. He has interrogated more suspects than anyone else.
Headley was basically the son of a Pakistani media star and a blue-blood woman, an aristocrat almost, from Philadelphia.
David Headley was born Daoud Gilani in Washington, D.C. in 1960. Headley grew up in Pakistan. He attended its elite military academy but left before completing his training. At the age of 17, he moved to Philadelphia with his mother. In America, however, he soon went off the rails. In 1988, he was arrested at Frankfurt Airport. He was in possession of heroin from Pakistan, which he intended to smuggle into the United States. On the trail of David Headley in New York, journalist Sebastian Rotella has researched Headley's story for the New York Times and the Washington Post, in part through the Snowden files.
One of the turning points in his life is that arrest at the Frankfurt airport in Germany in 1988. He gets caught by a customs agent, but I think the DEA is already on to him. So he quickly becomes an informant and manages to, he goes to prison, but for less time because he helps the DEA bust the people he was working with in the heroin deal.
After serving a short sentence, Headley moves to New York, where he continues to work for the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, as an informant. At the same time, he's still dealing drugs on a large scale. But in 1988, Headley is exposed by an undercover agent and indicted. Although he has reoffended and is being held on remand, David Headley offers to continue working for the DEA on the New York drug scene. His advantage is that, like many New York drug dealers at the time, he's a Muslim. This second deal with the authorities also comes off. After only half a year, Headley is released on parole and is once again an informant on the New York drug scene.
And then everything sort of starts to speed up because he's going back and forth to Pakistan. He's smuggling drugs. He's working as an informant. He does an arranged marriage where his father helps arrange a marriage with a very devout Pakistani woman of the Pakistani elite. But he also has this relationship with a Canadian woman here in the United States, blonde, woman who very American or Western type woman, and so he's married, he's having relationships with both of them at the same time. And in that period, in the late 90s, he starts to radicalize.
Drug dealer, undercover agent, and an increasingly radicalized Muslim. It's a life between two worlds. But then comes 9/11, with 3,000 deaths. With New York in a panic for weeks, investigators suddenly began to focus on Headley.
A woman who was his girlfriend at the time was at a bar, and she was talking to a bartender she knew at this bar, and talking about how her boyfriend, Headley, had actually been excited about the attacks and had expressed his interest, because he was of Pakistani descent, of going himself to Pakistan to train with terrorists.
For the first time, Headley is suspected of being a terrorist, At the DEA's massive headquarters, a momentous meeting takes place involving Headley, his liaison officers, and counterterrorism investigators from the FBI.
So you can imagine the message that was sent to the investigators. Yes, you have a tip that this guy is involved in terrorism, but he's our guy, and he's so much our guy that we're making him available to you in our headquarters.
The U.S. narcotics officers protect their informant. In doing so, they prevent further investigation by the FBI. They even offer him to the FBI and the CIA as an informant in the fight against terrorism.
Le 11 septembre, tous les services.
After September the 11th, the world's intelligence services, especially those in the United States, had only one interest: counterterrorism. And they were particularly focused on the link between the financing of terrorism and the drugs trade. The U.S. intelligence services hadn't been able to prevent 9/11, but now, at all costs, they wanted to hunt down those responsible for the attacks.
Mike Hayden is supremely qualified for this position.
In the war against terrorism, President Bush placed his most experienced man at the head of the country's most important intelligence service. Four-star General Michael Hayden, who had been director of the NSA for many years, was put in charge of the CIA.
But after 9/11, we did a lot of harsh things. And honest people can disagree with some of the things we did, and we can have that discussion. But, you know, all of us kind of resolved to do everything within our power and within law to make sure it never happened again.
Following the attacks on New York, it soon became clear who was responsible: Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda terrorist network. The United States and her allies go to war against the terrorists in Afghanistan. The Western Alliance's most important partner is neighboring Pakistan, which becomes a supply hub.
Pakistan was an ally, but it was the ally from hell. All right? It was a very, very difficult ally. When I went there and tried to get the Pakistanis to do something against al-Qaeda, we were just coming from completely different places.
Officially the West's partner, in reality, Pakistan was supporting Islamic terrorist groups through its ISI intelligence service. German and French forces are also deployed in Afghanistan with a NATO mandate. Officially, Pakistan is their ally, but behind the scenes, it is also their adversary. The German intelligence service, the BND, is well networked in the region. Despite this, deploying troops in the Hindu Kush is a challenge. Who is a friend and who is an enemy? From 2011 to 2016, Gerhard Schindler was president of the BND.
Naturally, it was the task of the German intelligence service to clarify interests in the region, but also to determine where the Taliban and al-Qaeda were getting their support. Where were the resources, their fighters and their material coming from?
Pakistan is playing a murderous double game. Terrorists from all over the world continue to use the country as a safe haven.
All these groups, all these suspicious figures travel via Pakistan. Pakistan is the hub, and as has been proved, the Pakistani authorities do nothing about it.
That would also prove to be the case with David Headley, who at this point in time is still living in New York. Headley still has 2.5 years of a suspended sentence hanging over him, but the U.S. government makes him an offer. His lawyer is Howard Leader.
The sense I had was that this went beyond DEA. There was likely to be also CIA and/or FBI involvement. The judge spoke. She said she'd received a submission from the government. She was willing to terminate his supervised release early. And she acknowledged that what he was about to embark upon was highly dangerous, and she wished him well.
In this heated situation, the U.S. government sends David Headley to Pakistan. His mission is to gather information on terrorist organizations. Here in Lahore, he makes contact with the Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorist group.
If you're looking for sources inside a terrorist organization, you are by definition largely looking for bad people. If you're a squeaky clean guy who never goes near any dangerous people, then you're useless to me as a source.
As an agent and intelligence service officer, for many years Sam Faddis carried out and even headed foreign operations for the CIA.
You are clearly going to have a problem when it then comes to what we would call vetting your source. And I am all the time going to be trying to figure out, you're really with me, you're not with me, you're still with me, you're telling me the truth, you're telling me some of the truth, you're trying to get me killed, are you helping me? And that may change from week to week.
Just how cautious were the intelligence services with regard to their man in Pakistan? Headley's links with Lashkar-e-Taiba are getting closer, and he's given a contact. His name is Sajid Mir.
Sajid Mir, in particular, at this point, is this young rising star in Lashkar-e-Taiba who's in charge of a lot of the international operations. Anyone who has a connection to the West, Americans, French, Australians, who has a profile that they can use in the West is of interest, and Headley becomes one of those people who is recruited by Sajid Mir.
In Lashkar-e-Taiba's camps, recruits are trained and indoctrinated, and terrorist attacks planned. Headley passes through 5 of these camps. Supported by the ISI, the terrorist organization Lashkar-e-Taiba is a monster that has gotten out of control. These scenes were filmed outside its headquarters in Lahore. By now, Headley is perfectly networked with terrorists. He and his Pakistani wife have started a family and lead a widely traditional Islamic life.
Headley is an individualist, and even within Lashkar-e-Taiba, he was never completely part of it. In a sense, they always kind of kept him a little bit separate because they realized he was too much of an individualist. But he was perfect to do missions where you needed just one person, and a person that had its own initiative.
Early in 2006, Headley travels to the Khyber Pass district in Pakistan's border region with Afghanistan. He intends to smuggle arms, but is detained by ISI officials at a checkpoint. After several hours, he's told that he will not be permitted to continue his journey. But Headley's efforts have brought him to the attention of the ISI.
In January of 2006, Headley gets a call from this guy, Major Iqbal, who recruits him, says, you're going to work for Pakistani intelligence, the ISI.
Not even Interpol or the FBI has a photograph of the sinister ISI agent, Major Iqbal, who is being sought worldwide.
Sajid Mir is his handler for Lashkar, and Major Iqbal is his handler for the ISI. They are sending him to Mumbai to start to do reconnaissance.
With this American passport, David Coleman Headley travels to India, even though relations between Pakistan and India are hostile. In Mumbai, Headley opens an office as an immigration consultant, has visiting cards printed, and passes himself off either as a diplomat or a businessman. Headley starts to scout out terrorist targets in Mumbai, like the Oberoi Trident Hotel, which is popular with business travelers, the main railway station, which handles up to 4 million passengers a day, the Nariman House, a Jewish-American center with a hostel, the Leopold Cafe, and the luxurious Taj Mahal Palace Hotel.
What Headley created for them was on a par with what the CIA would create for a similar operation, which is not me saying that the CIA will go carry out terrorist attacks. But if you're going to go carry out an operation of this complexity, wherever it is, of this level of detail, we would go as an American organization and gather intelligence for a long time and build a really robust package of information. Most terrorist groups, frankly, aren't capable of doing that.
Summer 2005. From time to time, Headley is back in New York, living with his Canadian wife.
His wife in New York is very angry at him because she's discovered that he has this other family in Pakistan. So she calls and phones a tip line and gives a tip to the FBI that goes to the Joint Terrorism Task Force, that her husband is involved with Lashkar-e-Taiba and goes to training camps in Pakistan and sort of sets out the basics. At some point, they call his DEA handler, who's someone who's still in touch with occasionally, and the DEA handler vouches for him. He says, as far as I know, You know, he's not someone who would attack the United States, nor is he a terrorist.
The tips from Headley's Canadian wife are not pursued any further. He's able to continue his activities unimpeded. So, David Headley is able to leave the United States and travel back to Mumbai. In 2007, Headley marries for the third time. His new wife is Faiza Otala, a Moroccan medicine student 20 years his junior. Headley takes her with him to Mumbai, ostensibly on a honeymoon trip. They book in at the Taj Mahal Palace Hotel. After the attacks, Faiza spoke to an Indian online portal via a live video link.
For me, it was honeymoon, but for him, it was not. I think he was trying to use me for something.
Even though it was their honeymoon, the couple quarreled.
His Moroccan wife even went to the US consulate in Islamabad complaining about her husband, and they didn't take her seriously.
I visited the embassy, and they made me look like a crazy person.
Even though Faiza tells the CIA about her husband's terrorist plans, she's simply turned away. Despite the highly sensitive nature of her information, the CIA fails to act on it, with tragic consequences.
It's a huge mistake. It's a massive mistake. He's not just an American. I mean, if he pops to the surface, he's going to be an American who has an affiliation with American law enforcement or intelligence. And therefore, that just adds to his ability to do what he wants to do for the guys that he's really working for, which is ISI and Lashkar.
On the evening of November 26, 2008, around 8 p.m., 10 Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorists disembarked from a dinghy in a coastal slum area of Mumbai. At 9:30 p.m., the attacks begin when heavily armed two-man terrorist units storm restaurants, luxury hotels, the Jewish Center, and the city's biggest railway station, firing indiscriminately at men, women, and children. In the hotels, the attackers hunt down their victims, searching for them room by room and starting fires everywhere. One two-man terror unit storms the Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus railway station, randomly killing people with hand grenades and assault rifles. 58 people die and 104 are wounded. The two terrorists then roam the city, firing at civilians and police officers. It's not until hours later that the attackers are trapped at a roadblock. One of the terrorists dies in a hail of police bullets. The other is wounded and taken to hospital. Interrogated that same night, the police learn that he's a 21-year-old Pakistani by the name of Ajmal Kasab. Kasab tells his Indian interrogators everything, that the series of attacks was controlled directly from Pakistan, live via mobile phone from a command center in Karachi.
They were told by their handlers, do the maximum damage as early as you can, then acquire a vantage position from where you can continue as long as you can.
But who controlled the terrorists in Mumbai? Today, Devin Bharti is a Joint Commissioner of Police. When the attacks took place in November 2008, he was one of the first officers to combat the terrorists.
During one of the skirmishes, one terrorist dropped his mobile phone there. So I got hold of that phone, and when that call started coming from there on that number, I picked up the phone. I tried to talk to the handler, posing as a waiter of the hotel.
Devin Bharti, seen holding the mobile phone that was seized. He's waiting for the call from Pakistan.
It was Sajid Mir.
Sajid Mir, David Coleman Headley's handler, is personally controlling the attack via mobile phone. The terrorists in Mumbai were talking on the phone to their handlers in Pakistan via a provider in New Jersey in the United States. The British intelligence service was listening in live. The British, it is said, even had access to Sajid Mir's laptop in the command center in Karachi.
Western intelligence agencies realized at that point that this was a major operation that wasn't just being planned in some remote tribal area. It was being operated and directed in urban centers within Pakistan.
The instructions from the masterminds in Karachi were clear. They wanted the highest possible number of victims and maximum media attention. They were to fight to the death. On no account were they to allow themselves to be taken alive.
It is chilling reading the transcripts to show just how well coordinated those Mumbai plots were. And it wasn't being coordinated by a terrorist. You can tell the difference between a terrorist directing a plot and an intelligence officer.
Terror on the orders of mastermind Sajid Mir. Only a few days previously, Judge Jean-Louis Bruguière had been in Pakistan to press for his arrest.
When I heard about Mumbai and Sajid Mir, I asked why he hadn't been arrested beforehand. Had he been stopped, the attacks in Mumbai might never have happened.
David Headley receives coded messages of congratulation. The code word for the attacks is graduation. Major Iqbal is also congratulated by the Pakistani intelligence service.
You have to step back and look at this. Why is this attack so successful? It is a state-sponsored terrorist attack. Overseen, funded, directed by the ISI, or totally in conjunction, in tandem, in teamwork with Lashkar and the ISI. And that is the reason it is so successful and so outrageous.
The terrorist attacks in Mumbai were financed and controlled by the ISI, even though the Pakistani intelligence service was a partner and ally of the West. The series of attacks in Mumbai have left deep scars, a trauma for the victims, families, and the whole country. And indeed, after the devastating attacks in Mumbai, Headley and the masterminds behind him set their sights on Europe. They want revenge for the publication of caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad.
Headley meets with Ilyas Kashmiri, who at this point is one of the most dangerous terrorists in Pakistan, if not the world. So he very seamlessly, the plot transfers to Al-Qaeda.
Amongst other things, Ilyas Kashmiri is also responsible for a failed bomb attack in New York. He is on the CIA's most wanted list.
Headley is very excited about it, but he also knows he's moving into a much more dangerous and difficult world, which is doing an attack on the West and doing it for Al-Qaeda. And sure enough, that will be his downfall.
His new target is the Danish capital, Copenhagen. Headley makes several trips there. He films and takes photographs of the main railway station, the D'Angleterre Luxury Hotel, the main synagogue, and the editorial building of the Jyllands-Posten newspaper, which published the caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad. This photograph was found on Headley's mobile.
What they envision is an attack, Mumbai style, that they will get gunmen who will storm this newspaper building in the heart of Copenhagen, take hostages, make sure that the media is there, decapitate the hostages, and throw the heads out the windows. And it will happen in the most peaceful, unimaginable place possible, which is Copenhagen, Denmark.
In Headley's records, the plans for the attack, codenamed the Mickey Mouse Project, are documented in great detail.
The Danish plot, Headley was going to do it himself. He was going to kill the people in the newspaper himself.
David Headley travels to Britain. Ilyas Kashmiri has provided him with contacts to a sleeper cell within the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. What Headley doesn't know is that since 2009, the cell has been under surveillance by the British Secret Service. MI6 picks up Headley's trail and liaises with the Americans. He's now in the crosshairs of the US authorities. At a crisis meeting in the White House in October 2009, the director of the CIA pushes the president to take action.
Principals in Washington, D.C., including the president, were briefed on what information was gathered during this investigation, whether or not to arrest Headley or to continue to surveil him.
Agents in Chicago prepare to arrest Headley before he can return to Europe to plan an attack.
The FBI agents approached him at the airport, brought him to the FBI headquarters in Chicago, and sat in a room with Mr. Headley and started talking with him.
As they take him into the interrogation room, they have his former DEA handler standing where he can see him. They don't talk, but he sees him. And the message there is, it's time to do what you've done in the past. Change sides, get with the program, become an informant.
At FBI headquarters, Headley immediately offers to betray his accomplices. He wants a deal. Headley makes the FBI a spectacular offer. He's prepared to help them capture Sajid Mir.
You know, I've studied thousands of terrorists. He's the only one that I can think of. So you can see that it's very unusual for a terrorist group to have a psychopath, a sociopath. Because you have to have this feeling of groups. You sacrifice for the group. You do things for the group. A psychopath, sociopath cannot do that. You know, it's all about me.
What did the American intelligence services know about their agent David Headley? How long had he actually been working for them? And what was his brief? When did they learn of his role as an ISI double agent? As part of the US government's deal with him, David Headley's links with the US intelligence services are kept secret. And what motivated the US authorities, in spite of everything, to strike a deal with David Headley once again? Public Prosecutor Daniel Collins.
There are certain things that law enforcement and the government does in order to investigate this type of activity, some of which needs to be classified, some of which needs to be kept from the public's eye. And so you want to keep those things guarded.
The world will probably never learn the whole truth. As always in David Headley's life as an agent, a deal is struck. For the terrorist attacks in Mumbai, which cost 166 lives, and for planning further attacks in Copenhagen, Headley is sentenced to 35 years in prison, a sentence he is still serving. But he has avoided the death penalty and extradition to India or Denmark. In return, Headley had to swear to remain silent about his activities as an agent, and his file is sealed. David Headley, agent, double agent, terrorist. Today, it is said Lashkar-e-Taiba, the terrorist organization behind the horrific attacks in Mumbai, is stronger than ever. The former ruler of Pakistan, General Pervez Musharraf, refuses to accept criticism, especially any directed at Lashkar-e-Taiba.
So how do you call them terrorists? I call them mujahideen. It is this organization of Lashkar-e-Taiba. They are the best NGOs in the world.
Politicians and heads of state from all over the world are pictured here with their partner, Pervez Musharraf, including the then French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, even though Musharraf is one of the main supporters of the very organizations that are bringing terrorism to Europe. Richard Kemp is a former intelligence service advisor to the British cabinet.
There's no question that the ISI is interested in energizing and maintaining the terrorist conflict against the West. And somehow you will find a link from most terrorist attacks around the world that go back directly or indirectly to the ISI. So they are a major facilitator and supporter and director of terrorist actions against the West.
Mumbai, Copenhagen, Paris. The trail always leads to Pakistan. And what about other countries? Is there evidence there too of links between terrorists and the allies of our intelligence services?
I'm quite certain that these links which you mention in relation to Pakistan can also be traced back to Saudi Arabia and also to North Africa. And when you see that one North African country, Tunisia, currently produces the greatest number of terrorists, something that you would never imagine, it's clear that there are links, especially within the Arab world. These links simply exist. So I would not be inclined to focus on one particular country.
Since 2014, Europe has been shaken by a wave of terrorist attacks that were modeled on the attacks in Mumbai. The trail leads to masterminds in Arab and North African countries, which are actually our partners in the fight against terrorism and in dealing with the refugee crisis. In the case of Anis Amri, who carried out the terrorist attack in Berlin in 2016, the trail leads to an ISIS handler with links to the Libyan intelligence service. He's said to have persuaded Amri to carry out the attack and then helped him get away.
I'm not at all surprised that Anis Amri had a contact with an operator from Libya. Because if you look at the nature of his attack, He targets the Berlin market and then he disappears.
وعلى جهاد عدو الله ما استطعت إلى ذلك سبيلا والله على ما أقول شهيد.
How he travels is also fascinating. From Germany into the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Italy. Did he plan that himself? I never believed it. The information that suggests that he had a handler who was guiding him now makes sense.
Officially, most attacks are attributed to terrorists acting alone. But in reality, masterminds with links to the intelligence services of our partners are often behind them.
We've evolved in terms of dealing with who is organizing terrorist attacks. It's not just necessarily individuals that have become radicalized. There are people that have an intelligence background that may have been involved in the state machinery, be it in Iraq or Pakistan or Libya, but have that intelligence background nevertheless, but their intention is now to plot and plan attacks. And they are more deadly and more effective to orchestrate chaos.
Money against terrorism becomes money for terrorism.
It's a very dirty business. Huge amounts of money are being paid by the United States, Great Britain, Germany, other European countries, the EU, into resourcing terrorist attacks against us.
Take Pakistan, for example. Since 9/11, it has received more than $35 billion from the Western alliance, a deadly investment.
The West very often wants simple solutions. They want simple answers. This is the problem, here's the money, please fix it. And that attitude can often be exploited by others who know the right things to say, but then do what they want afterwards.
Can intelligence services be trusted for the values they purport?
In this business, it seems, if a job is to be done, moral views have to take second place.
So that's how it is.
It's the nature of the business because in the end, it's all about success.
A look at our intelligence services and their cooperation with difficult partners in the war against terrorism shows that sometimes they themselves create the terrorism they are supposed to be fighting. We can only hope that politicians and the intelligence services do not repeat the mistakes of the past.